Good evening. I'm Charles Overby, chairman of the Overby Center for Southern Journalism and Politics. I'm delighted to welcome you here tonight. We have an interesting program ahead, and we have a distinguished panel. I'm especially pleased that Walter Hussman would come here from Little Rock to help lead us in this discussion on objectivity and whether it's a thing of the past. Walter, I told a friend of mine I was coming to moderate a program on objectivity, and he said, "Do they still have that anymore?" Walter's the owner of the Arkansas Democrat Gazette and several other media properties, and the School of Journalism at the University of North Carolina is named for Walter, the Hussman School of Journalism and Media, thanks to his generosity. We also have from Dallas, Texas, Tony Peterson, who's the Senior National Fellow at the Overby Center, and he is the former executive editor of the Houston Chronicle and professor emeritus of journalism at SMU. We have the Dean of Journalism here at Ole Miss, Dr. Andrea Hickerson, and we're always glad to have Dr. Hickerson join us for programs. She's also the co-director of I want to get this right, Andrea, the National Center for Narrative Intelligence. That sounds like a mouthful.
It is.
Yeah. And then I'm especially pleased to have one of our outstanding students here with us tonight, Violet Gira. Violet, most of you know, is the editor-in-chief of the Daily Mississippian, and she's a member of the Honors College here. And she's going to bring a youthful perspective to this. So let's get started, Walter. You and I have been talking about this issue of objectivity for several years now, and you've taken it almost on like a one-person campaign. What got you involved in trying to focus so much on objectivity?
Well, it happened in 2017, and when my wife, Ben, who's here tonight, and she went to Ole Miss, graduated from here, we were on a bicycle trip in Vietnam with 6 other couples. And so, if you all have been abroad, a lot of times it's hard to get any U.S. news, and usually the only channel you can get it on is CNN International, and, you can get quite a bit of news there. So we were getting ready to go down to dinner. I'm kind of getting dressed, and I'm watching CNN, and a really good reporter, Christiane Amanpour, comes on, and she's done some great reporting out of the Middle East and doing some more right now. She comes on, but she wasn't reporting. She was doing an ad for her employer, which is CNN. And so she said, "I don't believe in the false equivalency of giving both sides to a story." Well, I stopped buttoning my shirt, and I thought, wow, what, did I hear that right? I was in journalism classes at North Carolina. It's the first thing I learned. You always give both sides, Then she said, my job is to determine the truth and then share that with you, the viewers. And I thought, well, that's great, but how many times in my experience in newspaper publishing have we thought we knew the truth? And it turned out to be something different. And I thought, our experience had been usually, rather than, being so sure we know the truth, we need to approach this with a little humility, give as many facts as we can until it seems completely obvious it's the truth, and let the readers decide for themselves. So anyway, it troubled me for the rest of that trip. I thought, what if our readers I think like she does about not giving both sides, and, we know the truth and we'll let you know that. So I thought, well, what I can do is I can go home and tell our readers what we do believe, and that prompted me to write a statement of core journalistic values. And I wrote it out, and it's pretty short. And I showed it to all of our editors, see if they wanted to edit it anyway. I sent it to a dean at the journalism school, North Carolina, where I went to school. Sent it to some newspaper owners, tried to get some vetting on it. What do you all think about this? And made a few minor modifications, but we started publishing it in January of 2017. That's now like 6 years ago. Yeah. And it's interesting. Immediately we heard from our readers, thank you for telling us what your standards are. You know, now we know how we can hold you accountable. This is resonating with people, you know. And so, anyway, I just thought, you know, it also sends a signal not only to our subscribers and our readers, sends a signal to all the people that work there, you know. And so I was talking recently with, you know, our daughter, who's the publisher of the paper. I said, I read about a lot of these dissensions in some of the newsrooms around the country. We don't seem to have that. And she said, well, you know, I think when they you know, think about coming to work here and they say these core values, if they don't agree with those, they can go somewhere else. So it may be a self-sorting situation. But anyway, you know, the other thing that started catching my attention after that was this polls that were done by Gallup. Gallup has been measuring trust in news and news media and a lot of other things, the Supreme Court, the presidency, Congress, for about 40 years. And the trust in news and the news media has been plummeting, you know. And so in 2020, they did a survey, you know, a typical presidential poll might be 800, 1,200 people, accuracy plus or minus a few percent. They did a poll of 20,000 Americans, and all 50 states, had people in all 50 states. And this thing came back and it said that they asked people, do you have almost no confidence in news reporting, or not much confidence, or more confidence, or a lot of confidence? 86% of the people said not much confidence or very little confidence in news reporting. This wasn't about opinion. This is about news reporting. I thought, my goodness, this is terrible, you know. And so anyway, that's why, you know, I thought, you know, I'm going to try to work on this as much as I can and trying to come up with ideas on things we can do. So I'm retired as publisher of the paper. I've been doing it for 40 some odd years. Our daughter's now the publisher. And so I thought, well, this give me a little time to work on this. So.
Well, it's quite a interest that you have, and you now have time to deal with it. I want to ask Tony. Tony, you've taught students about this and have given them a historical perspective about objectivity and truth. You want to talk a little bit about how you used to teach your students about this issue?
Well, there are all sorts of definitions of objectivity that you can come up with, and Walter makes a really good point about getting the other side. I have always thought, and I told students, that in journalism schools we historically have talked about getting the other side of the story, and we really don't know how to do that. Often in a news organization, that means calling somebody up at 4:30 and telling that person, by the way, on the 5 o'clock news, we're going to run a story that says you're a crook. Are you really a crook? And that's somehow the idea that passed for getting the other side of the story. And all of the discussion about objectivity being out of date, I don't agree with it, of course. There are a couple of things that do stick and that resonate with me. And one is that the ideological construct for objectivity really does date from, first of all, in the 20s, but more so out of the Hutchins Commission report in 1947 that established the standards for a free and responsible press. And objectivity and fairness were very much a part of that. And what the critics of objectivity say is that that construct came about by a group of white males, men in their 50s, well-educated, heavily Protestant, and that construct stuck in a way that basically was intended to preserve the status quo. Certainly, the ideas of diversity and inclusion didn't come along until later, really in terms of major news organizations in the 60s or 70s, and that was way too late. There's no question about that. But I also think that at the heart of it, journalism is about comprehensive, relentless reporting and fact checking. And that is what I hope we can continue to teach in schools. And if we do that, we're going to be able to continue to produce journalists who can produce journalism that really matters.
Thank you. Andrea, unfortunately, most of my friends fall in this category that Walter mentioned where they have little or no trust in the media. And these are my friends. They know that I've been involved in the media all my life. If some of my friends were here today, they would ask you, do you believe in objectivity as the dean of the journalism school? And is objectivity taught at Ole Miss? They'd be very cynical. So I'd ask that question on their behalf.
Sure. Well, I actually got that question at the Tupelo Kiwanis a couple weeks ago where I was speaking about AI and news. And this man very unironically said, so you teach them how to get the truth in journalism? And I said, yes, we do. And at the end, he came over and he said, you are a shining star in the galaxy of journalism schools by teaching people to get the truth. And which is shocking, but it was a compliment. I take it. But I think one of the biggest problems I see in journalism is that we don't explain what we do very well, right? And so often it gets tripped up in values and political rhetoric because, it's been a very personal process for journalists and for organizations. But when it comes to communicating with the audience about how we got the story, we've shied away from doing that, maybe so much, just take our word for it. We've done the work ourselves, but we need to kind of show the proof a little bit, how we got the sources, how we did the fact checking. And we've seen a boom in fact checking that people do like PolitiFact, which is, won the Pulitzer Prize, and various localized and national things of fact checking. And that I think has helped a little bit, but there's frankly not enough of that going on and explaining. We haven't made a good case about why journalism is valuable. And it's exciting to be a dean in journalism school right now, and there may be some of you in here who came here to study to be a sports journalist or a fashion journalist, noble professions, but it's exciting to see somebody really get into it, decide that their passion is in housing reporting, right? Something else, these community things that people just don't know about because they didn't know that was something that they could actually perceive to do.
Well, that's good. I'm glad you got those plaudits in Tupelo. Violet, you're in a whole different generation, operating really in a different orbit from what some of us have. How does this whole issue of objectivity intersect with you at the Daily Mississippian and your life in general?
I would say greatly. I wrote my first story for the Daily Mississippian about 3.5 years ago, and it's something that I have grappled with as a student manager almost every day since. In every story we write, from the little ones to the big ones, we really place emphasis in taking stock of what duties we owe to our readers and using that to kind of inform what lens we use to report stories through. But ultimately, we ground everything in truth. In truth and fact, and we place really high emphasis on getting both sides of the story, no matter whether you agree with the other side or not. That's something we try really hard to do, and that's difficult at times when you really disagree personally with what the other side of the story is. But yeah, it's something we consider a lot at the DM and in my personal life as a reporter.
Do you get any pushback from your reporters when you push them to get the other side of the story?
Yes, there was a story we did last year on an event, and we had the conversation beforehand because I knew personally this reporter was not in favor of what this speaker was saying in the event. So we had that conversation going into it, and I get the story after the fact, and I'm like, this is not publishable. So we had to go back through it and kind of think about, okay, we're saying this, but what's the other side of this? The people who attended this event, they were there for a reason. They were there because they agreed with what this person was saying. So even though it may not be our personal opinion, it's important to represent the fact that it is other people's opinions and that there's value in that.
Thank you. Walter, as you know all too well, there was a study out of the Arizona State where they had like 35 journalists who said objectivity is a thing of the past.
Yeah.
And that brought you really into the fray and even led to your writing a column for the Wall Street Journal that gave national exposure to what you're trying to do. You want to talk about that some?
Sure. This slide is the first page of this thing. It was published on January 25th, 2023, and it was a grant that the journalism school got to do a survey of other editors around the country, and actually talked to 75 editors around the country and got their thoughts on, what about objectivity as a standard. Interestingly enough, they almost all agreed with each other, these 75 people, and they said, uh, objectivity is kind of passe. We need to move on. We need to have other standards, et cetera. And I thought, gosh, that's odd. You didn't find one person that disagreed with them. But anyway, but anyway, this report came out. So my thought was that prior to this report coming out, the debate about objectivity in journalism was kind of an inside baseball kind of a discussion. It was just mainly people in the journalism world that were talking about this. And it wasn't really the larger public talking about, is objectivity a good standard or not? But when this report came out, there were people who definitely disagreed with this in journalism. One is Brett Stevens, and he is a columnist for the New York Times, pretty good columnist. And you can see he ran this op-ed literally, this other report came out January 25th, here February 9th, pretty quickly. How to destroy what's left of the mainstream media's credibility. He said, if the media wanted to shoot themselves in the foot, they couldn't have done a much better job than to come out and all agree objectivity was an idea that should have passed. I'd also totally disagreed with it, and I thought, I'm gonna write something. I don't know if the Wall Street Journal will publish it or not, but they did, and so that was on February the 15th. That was 6 days later after the New York Times. So this was in the Wall Street Journal, and the next month, March 24th, Marty Barron. Now, I don't know if everybody knows Marty Barron. Probably a lot of you do, but how many people have seen the movie Spotlight? Yeah. See a show of hands? Yeah. If you hadn't seen it, it's a great movie. And basically, Marty Barron had been editor of the Miami Herald. He got hired to go become the editor of the Boston Globe. And they started digging. What Spotlight referred to a group of about 4 or 5 reporters for the Globe who all they did was investigative reporting. And they started investigating rumors of clergy abuse of young people, Catholic clergymen. And so anyway, they got into that, and now it's a movie. It's a great movie. You might think about major in journalism ought to watch that movie. I think so. He pretty much disagreed with it too. After he published his op-ed, I thought, wow, this is really getting more of the public's attention. Now we got the 3 large national newspapers, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, all with, people in the journalism world saying we don't agree with this. And so I think if you're in journalism, you're interested in that, that's something you ought to be aware of. And there have been a lot of follow-ups with letters to the editor in these publications about it too. I think there's a real disconnect kind of between some of the people in the journalism world who would argue, we don't need to use objectivity. There's a disconnect between them and the general public, because in these surveys that Gallup does, they ask them, and their responses are, we just don't feel like what we read is where we can get objective facts, objective information. We think it's intentionally biased. So, the public's important in this, because if the public doesn't trust news reporting in America, we've got a huge problem.
So, Tony, I would ask you, when you were editor of the Houston Chronicle, and you had objectivity as one of your main goals, does that dilute your effort to have good, aggressive, investigative reporting? Can aggressive reporting and objectivity coexist?
Absolutely, they coexist. And in fact, in my opinion, objectivity comes about by aggressive and really relentless reporting and looking at facts and as I said earlier, double checking and triple checking, because complex subjects escape easy explanation. And too often we want to make easy explanations for complex occurrences in government and business, in local news, whatever the circumstance. And that is why that type of detailed reporting and that type of effort is needed. And Walter mentioned, of course, that the famous investigative team for the Boston Globe and some of the work that they have done. There are really quite good investigative teams all over the country, and they do nothing except this type of relentless reporting and fact checking. And out of that comes a great deal of information that the public absolutely needs to know. Today, I just did a word search on the best journalism of the 20th century, and the top three things to pop up. Number one, John Hershey's reporting on Hiroshima in the New Yorker. Number two, Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, that started the environmental movement. And number three, Watergate. And if you've never heard of John Hershey, you've never heard of Rachel Carson, by all means, go back and read their work. It is landmark journalism, and it is exactly that. No one would say that there's a lack of objectivity in that. And all three of those pieces of journalism had enormous effects on society, on government, and how we think about journalism. And if we somehow lose sight of that type of work and that type of effort that needs to be involved in journalism, we're going to suffer as a society. And, we've so often talked about the relationship between journalism, news media, and democracy. And democracy depends on that type of quality journalism and that relentless reporting that discovers truths and that shows objectivity, regardless of how you look at a particular issue, politically or any other way. That type of reporting that can disclose that material truth is what's essential.
So, objectivity is seen by many people through the lens of political reporting. And this center focuses on both journalism and politics. And so I'll just ask kind of what the obvious question of 2023 is today. How has Donald Trump changed the calculus of objectivity in news, and has it changed the way people view the news media today? And I'll start with you, Andrea. How much has Donald Trump changed the whole discussion about objectivity?
I'm inclined to think he hasn't changed it that much. He just vocalized what people already thought in some cases. So I think cable news was really bad for journalism in the sense that by having access to 24-hour news, it gave people space to fill. And so they just filled that space by talking. And that's when opinion and news reporting became indistinguishable to a lot of people. So I think we were headed this way. And there's a lot of people who didn't identify with the news or didn't feel like the stories that were covered reflected their realities. And so I think he voiced some frustration. Although what I do think maybe he has done is he's catalyzed the rhetoric about it, right? And has made it kind of lazy speaking about the way we talk about journalists, about, this is a liberal publication, this is a conservative one. Like, that's hard to hear as somebody who believes in that journalism is incredibly hard work and incredibly practical, right? Is that right now what it has done is it has put it as at a disadvantage of having to be on the defense about our work and what it means for communities and what it means for democracy, because there's so much really important, valuable stuff. I'll give a quick example of something that surprised me. Years ago, I was doing research on immigrant media in the United States that was in a different language. And so it was interesting to hear, why are they still relevant if they have more choices and more people are speaking English? And this newspaper editor in Seattle, who was the editor of a Japanese language newspaper, I said, "What's your most popular article?" And she said, "How to Get a Divorce." And I've laughed about that, but I mean, it was just offering a really practical piece of information for people that had migrated to the US and needed that. And I think we've just lost that, and it has become a heightened rhetorical talking point. And how do we get past that that's the challenge.
It's a really good point, Andrea, about how people have a hard time with cable television distinguishing between news and opinion. So much of what cable news does is opinion, and if it were in a newspaper, presumably it'd be labeled opinion. I've thought for a long time television could save itself a lot of grief by labeling opinion as opinion. And so people merge this this 24-hour news, and so much of it is opinion. They just lump this into general news media.
And I'd say the same about a lot of talk radio as well too, where you've got people doing a little bit of news but a little of entertainment and representing different things. But if you tune at a certain point in time, you don't have that, and then they're trying to sell you a product the next minute. So it's all blurred on that area.
So, Violet, I wanted to ask you, and obviously, you in the news columns and the editorial columns, you're able to draw a distinction between the editorial page and the news. You just your editorial board just endorsed a candidate for governor here in Mississippi, and I'm sure you got some comments about that. Can you talk about that and then kind of relate to whether that causes people to view what you did as making the paper less objective?
So that is something we weighed very heavily in our decision on whether or not we were going to make an endorsement at all, because we were very concerned about people reading the Daily Mississippian editorial board endorses XYZ. We endorse Brandon Presley for governor, and then saying, "Oh, the Daily Mississippian is a left-wing newspaper. We can't, believe anything that they write. Nothing is going to be factual." So that's something we really worked very hard to mitigate in the way that we did the editorial. It's in the opinion section online. It's very clearly labeled opinion. In the paper, the news is at the front, opinion is at the back. And at the very end of the editorial, we wrote explicitly what the editorial board is, what we do, and why we do it. And in addition to the editorial endorsement, I wrote a piece on why we did the endorsement at all and how it relates to our function as a news organization. So we did consider all of that very greatly. Our intention in writing the editorial in the first place was, I think, a need to bring attention not to ourselves, not to Brendan Presley, not to Tate Reeves, but to the election period and its importance to Mississippi, Mississippians, and students at the University of Mississippi.
You were bold to do that. The great thing about this university, it has given the Daily Mississippian freedom of the press for many, many years and decades. We had that when I was the editor, and you have it now. But what, and I don't know, you may face this now. If we had done that back then, we had the freedom to do it, but the administration would have been all over us because of their concern about the legislature and appropriations and all that. Have you gotten any feedback from the administration?
No, we have not. And I think generally young people on this campus are so vocal that I don't know that can be something that they're afraid of, because people here are going to express their minds. They're going to hold demonstrations. They're going to hold protests. They're going to have Instagram, but people are going to say what they think. So I'm not sure that that's quite the issue that it was back then.
Walter, I know that your readers view objectivity often through the lens of partisanship, Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative, and you deal with real live readers on that issue every day. So can you talk about how you handle people reading the newspaper from a political point of view?
Yeah, well, we have we on our op-ed page and our Sunday perspective section, which is all opinion. We've got a lot of opinion columnists. We've got a lot of local opinion columnists. We got some of them conservative. We got some of them liberal, and so the readers comment a lot on that. But because we have this delineation of separating news and opinion, and that's one of our standards, most of I don't hear many of our readers comment about, oh, you're that's influencing your news coverage. Yeah, interesting situation we encountered years ago. We acquired the two newspapers in Chattanooga. One, the Times, was more liberal, and the Free Press was more conservative. And we determined, we can't still afford to publish 2 newspapers in Chattanooga. Market won't support it. So we merged the papers, but we decided to keep 2 editorial pages. And 20-something years later, we still have 2 editorial pages 7 days a week. So the Chattanooga Times has an editorial page, Chattanooga Free Press has an editorial page, and sometimes the editorials argue with each other. And so one of the unintended consequences of this is that if you have a newspaper and your editorials are more liberal, maybe like the New York Times, or more conservative like the Wall Street Journal, readers do tend to think, well, I bet that bleeds over into their news coverage. Well, Chattanooga, they couldn't figure, how does this bleed over? Because we got one editorial page arguing one thing and something else. We were so fortunate there because a couple of months after we acquired the paper and merged them and had 2 editorial pages, a local issue came up about the local water company. The local water company in Chattanooga was privately owned, which is highly unusual. Most municipal water companies are owned by, municipality. So the Times thought, it should be municipally owned, nonprofit, et cetera. And the Free Press said, no, look at the water rates here in Nashville and Knoxville, and our water rates are lower with this private company. So it was really great because the 2 editorial pages were arguing. So I think there is a tendency anytime you do write an editorial, and people are just going to think, that influences them. So you got to be very specific that you draw a sharp distinction between the news and the. I might make one comment about Trump on your former question. I think Donald Trump being so negative and aggressive and belligerent towards the press really has impacted the press, the people who cover the news. And I know, Marty Barron just came out with a book here, a couple of weeks ago. And he points out a lot of the people in the Washington Post are so offended, that the reporters and editors, about Donald Trump, calling them the enemies of the people and, worthless and, fake news. They said, well, we got to go to war with this guy. He's on one side. He says, we're the enemy. Well, we got to be at war with him. And Marty Barron came out with a famous quote. He said, we're not at war, we're at work. We've got a job to do, and if we do the job, that's strictly what we should do. We don't want to get drugged down into this with Trump. So I thought that's the best way to enunciate it.
Yeah.
Well, Walter, most community newspapers, as you know, their national news is provided by the Associated Press. And you've shared a few copies of letters and emails that you've sent to the Associated Press. Most editors just run whatever the AP sends. Walter pushes them back. So talk about that a little bit, about your challenging the AP on its objectivity.
Yeah, so, years ago, I'm sure Houston, most papers, certainly larger papers, had a position called a wire editor. And the wire editor would read the wires. They may have had more than one wire. Like we have the AP wire, we have the New York Times wire, we have the Washington Post wire. We have multiple wires. And the wire editor kind of 2 jobs. He would try to find the best, most cogent, interesting facts from the different wire services and meld it into one report. And we still do that. But another job of the wire editor was to try to detect any kind of bias or something that looked skeptical or wasn't sure it was really true, and maybe delete that or try to pursue and get more information about it. So we do get complaints that, we're too liberal or, sometimes we're too conservative, but about our news. And every complaint is about our wire service coverage, which is really interesting. It's not about our local coverage. And there has been some bias that's crept into the wire service reporting, less with the AP than the Washington Post, New York Times wire services, but there are reporters that write for the AP, and we've got them flagged because we've seen in the past it's kind of a problem. So I've actually gone up to New York. I met with the AP has a standards editor, and I've talked to him about this. And I said, you know, we're having a lot of our readers complain that some of your that's coming out of the AP is biased. Well, the AP is supposed to be the epitome of objectivity, you know. And I even was working with a foundation who offered to pay the full salary of someone who would, if they saw working for the AP, reporting to the AP, had the AP management had the authority to hire and fire them. But that person's job was just to look through the AP report every day. If they saw any examples of bias, they would sit down with management and say, "Hey, this might be an issue." And this was not an ombudsman that was going to report to the public. And AP said, well, we don't need any help financially, but we'll pay more attention to that. So anyway, we hear from our readers, and if we think they've got a valid point, we try to do something about it.
Tony, you have a good perspective on global journalism. You were past president of the Inter-American Press Association and have spent a lot of time in Latin America, South America with journalists. Is objectivity less of an issue, more of an issue beyond the United States, or what? How do they deal with this?
No, I think it's every bit as much of an issue, and more so in Latin America. You have newspapers that, very much like our newspapers of the past, they define themselves in a political sense, and that frequently happens in other sections of the world also. But what you also have, and just to talk a little bit more about the impact of Donald Trump, is that his meme of fake news traveled globally. The New York Times has done some really good work looking at the impact on the accusations and the calls of fake news in the political circles in many countries around the world. Latin America is one of those. India is one of those. Many countries in Asia, and some in Europe. So that whole concept that Donald Trump started, that anything he disagreed with, he immediately branded as fake news. That's become a global meme, and unfortunately, it's been effective in helping discredit news media around the world, newspapers, broadcast, and digital. So it's not like we're isolated in this country in that we have problems in terms of the credibility and the integrity and the public perception about news media. Unfortunately, it exists everywhere.
Thank you. We're going to go to the audience in a minute for questions, but I want to ask Andrea a question first. You brought up a few minutes ago the whole issue of artificial intelligence. You mentioned it. So I'd ask you, and this is an area of your expertise, I'd ask you, do you think artificial intelligence as it relates to news reporting is going to exacerbate the problem relating to objectivity or reduce it?
I think it has the potential to do both. But what I'm worried about is that people don't have a lot of understanding about how artificial intelligence works. And a lot of it is built by humans, designed by humans, right? And so all our mistakes are being eaten up by artificial intelligence and then spit out, right? So that concerns me because it's not fact, right? Artificial intelligence is not fact. It's a way of processing and synthesizing information. But if it's based on bad information, it's too easy to magnify that information. So that I think is potentially very negative. However, there are really great uses of artificial intelligence if we think about the potential for fact checking, right? So if I see a claim that's repeated in multiple news articles that is false, you can use artificial intelligence to map how that claim is being distorted and amplified in many different contexts. So that is powerful, but I'll say both the pluses and minuses of AI really involve humans, and they involve expertise, and they involve someone's judgment and ethics.
Good, thank you. Okay, now I want to let you ask questions about this or anything that's on your mind with this distinguished panel. Who has a question? Yes, sir.
So how do you think that the general public being more informed, how that has affected the pushback against this objectivity or lack thereof, as the general public is starting to see?
Anybody?
The question is how does the public, the fact that they're better informed than they used to be, how does that? Yeah. Yeah, well, people can get information from so many different places nowadays. And so a lot of times they see things that are reported in the news, but they have just seen something maybe on the internet or social media, or they've done some of their own research online that tends to contradict what they heard. And I think that can erode some of the credibility. There's actually, I wrote an article just the other day about open source journalism, which is the idea that, people are more and more trying to see the facts for themselves. Like, for example, a lot of the reporting coming out of Gaza right now, it's so difficult for actual reporters to get in there, but people are taking photographs or videos with their own cameras and putting those up. That's kind of like called open source information. So I think it makes a higher standard. It makes it more difficult, and the stakes are higher for the news media to get the story right.
Good question. Others?
Let me apologize in advance for this question. I want to remain friends with y'all. But in the interest of balance and fairness, what's the best argument against objectivity that you've read or seen? Or why would you think that objectivity would not be a good thing, that people have expressed to you that in these surveys that say that the media is old school? What is their best argument?
I don't know their best argument, but I'll take a crack at what some of their arguments are. The first argument might be, well, no one can be objective. We all have our own biases. We have our own frame of reference, where we grew up, where we came from, et cetera. So no one can be objective. They make that claim. Of course, the point is, that's true. No one can be objective, but objectivity is more about the method of reporting than it is the person doing the reporting. So the objective method would be to realize when you get onto a story, your initial glimpse is like looking through a keyhole in a door into the next room, and you're seeing a very narrow slice of what's in the next room. There's a lot you don't see. And if you could see more, you have a much clearer picture of what's going on, So objectivity is having some humility to realize, hey, I need to get this door further ajar so I can really see the whole picture, because I may not be seeing the whole picture right now, So, I mean, that's one of the arguments about it. And the other is that, well, we need to use other standards like moral clarity instead of objectivity. And so moral clarity is an interesting concept, but, whose morals are you going to use? I mean, morals differ all around the country, all around the world, for example. Some religions believe in, having 3 or 4 wives, and some religions don't. They're just, people have different moral standards, and moral standards change over time also, So I don't think moral clarity is a real good, but that argument is put forward that maybe that's a better standard.
I could add one more to that too, real quick. I think some people have criticized the background of journalists, right? That they only have a very specific experience. And so some of the national news organizations, there's been critiques that they overhire from particular journalism schools. And they tend to be elite Ivy Leagues. I don't know if we can call those journalism schools too, but that journalism isn't objective because so many journalists are the same to begin with. And I think that's interesting. And I think we are seeing some people be really more intentional about where they hire their reporters from and the experiences that they have. But I think that's an interesting argument.
Hi, Walter. It's
Hey,
Bruce. This may be a delicate question. It's not just for you. It may be most difficult for you. But Charles, you raised the issue of Donald Trump. But the question I really want the answer to is there, I'm old enough to remember when cable news started. It wasn't always, right, as opinion as it is now. would you lay the blame at any particular, if it's not too indelicate to talk about, is there any organization or part of the news that has allowed this to happen, that is most responsible? I mean, I think you know, bad habits are contagious, and this wasn't always the case. And then in the last 30 years, it's spread. And I just wondered if you all are in the field. I'm just a pianist. But what do you think?
If they gave Pulitzer Prizes for pianists, you'd win one, Bruce. Thank you for your question. So,
I'll take a stab at that. 1980 was when CNN came along, and Walter Isaacson ran CNN, and it was very fair, very balanced, objective reporting with bureaus around the world. And then, of course, when we had the Iraq War, they did a fantastic job of really reporting what was going on. And so, you know, Rupert Murdoch wanted to get in on the game too. He did something pretty amazing. He realized there's a huge barrier to entry to having another news channel, okay? And so roughly 55 million cable television and satellite subscribers. And so there was only so much space on each cable system for channels. So he offered all the cable operators, I know this because we have some cable TV systems, he offered them all $10 a subscriber to put it on. Wow. That's $550 million, and most cable companies took his offer and they put it on. But, you know, Fox came along, and it was interesting. When I was on the AP board, they would say, you know, it's interesting, Fox payroll is about a fourth what CNN's is, but they have higher ratings. And the reason they had higher ratings is because they had all these opinion shows. And the opinion shows are really inexpensive to produce compared to have somebody at a bureau in Johannesburg and Beirut and Tel Aviv, et cetera. So, you know. They feel like news to the average viewer. Yeah, that's right. That's right. And you know, when we announced our donation at the University of North Carolina, Tucker Carlson, who actually had his first job, opinion writing, it's editorial writing at our paper in Little Rock, he said, I'd like to do a segment, you know, and so I explained what we were doing, and he said, afterwards, he said, so what would you do if you ran a cable network? And I said, the first thing I would do is when Brett Baer is doing his news report at 5 o'clock, I would put a little box up there that says news, N-E-W-S. When your show comes up, I would put a box that said opinion. You know, you've got to delineate between these things, you know. And so, and then MSNBC saw Fox was really doing a pretty good job economically, you know, just giving opinions. They decided to do the same thing on the other side. But I'll tell you another thing that happened with cable news. It doesn't have to do with political right or left or anything. You know, if something happened in Cincinnati and it got reported in the Cincinnati newspaper or, you know, television stations, and if, you know, we would not report what happened in Cincinnati until the AP actually moved a story on it. And we were assured that if the AP moved a story, they were convinced it was accurate. Okay. When cable news came along and they had to keep giving news, you know, every 60 minutes every hour, 24 hours a day. So if anyone reported something that happened in Cincinnati, well, immediately the cable networks would report, this happened in Cincinnati. And then it turned out after 2 days, it turns out, well, that didn't really happen. So they wouldn't come back and issue a correction. They just, hey, it's news that it didn't happen, you know. And so a friend of mine in California told me, he said, you know, years ago, he said, I've gotten down when I watch television, especially cable television, if something's reported, I wait about 3 days to decide if it's really true. So, you know, the standards have changed, you know, with cable news on what they'll report compared to what newspapers and other television traditional media did previously.
The blurring seems to be intentional.
Yeah.
They won't put the boxes up as
Right. Right.
and that's hurtful.
So Fox has a big following among more conservatives, MSNBC among more liberals, to the extent that they say, well, this isn't really opinion. Well, they think, man, we won't get as much viewership on that because people aren't reinforcing their own opinions.
Tony,
Just-
anything you want to add to that?
Just a couple of thoughts. People in surveys consistently say that they want news that's down the middle, that's objective, and that doesn't have any bias in it, and yet they don't consume it. The data are absolutely clear about political leanings, and particularly on cable TV. And Walter is right, the mentality of news changed with CNN. There was an 18-month period, late 1979, early 1981, CNN, MTV, and ESPN all came on the air in that 18-month period. And that changed the perspective of what news is. And MTV, of course, has its own particular audience that's different. But ESPN, I think, has had a great impact on how we think about news. And Walter's right, it became instantaneous. It was not vetted. If there was video of a car chase in Phoenix, Arizona, it was on the air immediately. Didn't know what it was, and it may have been important, may not have been. And a lot of things like that turned out not to be important, but it became part of what cable news chases.
Other questions? Yes, sir. Get the mic.
I'm having a little trouble differentiating between objectivity and the truth. And based on what y'all said, that confusion is even greater for me personally. But when I hear Trump always referring to people, to the news, anybody who disagrees with him as fake news, I just can't believe that that he would not be challenged on it. Is it the news, the cable news? Are they so afraid of the ratings, and are they being driven by profits? Are they by their financial health? They just don't seem to want to defend their own industry.
Well, in the first place, Donald Trump doesn't have a lot of direct interaction with reporters. And that's kind of one of the results of where we are today in the political spectrum. Unfortunately, President Biden has very few news conferences because he doesn't go in front of reporters that much, doesn't want to. And I think all of that detracts from learning the truth and learning factual information. But you're right. I think in the environment we're in, politicians of all sides get away with a lot that just goes unvetted. And I don't see anything, unfortunately, that's going to change that anytime soon.
But it's not unvetted, it's unchallenged. They just let him go, and they report it as being fake news instead of just come out and say, no, this is the truth.
Yeah, I would take exception to that. I think the press was highly aggressive against Trump, and that they did challenge him in ways that they've never challenged any other president, to the point where it's now acceptable to say that Trump or any other politician lied, rather than saying here's one viewpoint and here's another viewpoint. The mainstream media have taken him on when it comes to, quote, truth and fake news. I'd say, if anything, it has polarized the public with the media, because the media has been willing to challenge Trump. Others can react to that if you want to. Andrew?
I think that's true. I think one thing that the media did not do, that does not do well in general, has nothing to do with Trump, is the just reporting what public officials say without doing any investigation at all. And that goes back to this, we've got to get it out there. This person said that. So I think there's a lot of that out there, but I don't know that that's unique to Trump or something. I mean, it's a double-edged sword for journalists too, because they want to know what the official source is saying about something. But if you don't trust the official source, it doesn't look like it's objective. So it's kind of stuck in this catch-22. Do you quote Trump in this article because people expect to hear the president's or the ex-president's opinion, or do you leave them out altogether and people say, well, that's not the whole story, they didn't go to the guy that was in charge of the whole thing? And I think that's a tricky balance for journalists.
Any other questions? Yes, sir. We'll get a microphone here.
I kind of want to switch this to sports, being that I'm a big fan of basketball, and I keep in touch with the NBA a lot, and I see that there's a lot of articles of them trying to promote their players with whether it's like some amazing statistics or something that they're doing on the field. But I also see other articles where they use those facts to generate some type of subjective opinion on based maybe on why they're the best player. And I wanted to ask, do you see any similar practices with other media outlets where on the surface they present objective facts, but it's really just to have a underlying theme of certain bias? And I wanted to ask, what are the potential risks of those who aren't able to differentiate or find a thin line between making an objective claim and using that objective claim to mask behind some biased theme?
I think it's really up to the reader, or the viewer or the listener to decide, if people are given objective facts, is there some ulterior, I guess you're saying maybe there's an ulterior motive to giving those facts, and maybe they could have given different facts, et cetera. So acts of omission. So I think we have to trust the reader, to determine for themselves if there's some ulterior motive.
And I would also say the worst job I ever had in my life was sports editor of the Houston Chronicle, because every human being is an expert on sports and athletes, and the arguments go on, and in a sense, that's what makes sports what we love.
In that regard, there's a kind of a famous saying that you might be entitled to your own opinions, but you aren't entitled to your own set of facts. And selective use of facts really goes to the heart of what we're talking about tonight on objectivity. Any last question? Yes, Mike.
Yeah, thank you, and I've enjoyed the discussion. My question has to do with endorsements. In my times as editor, that was kind of taken for granted. You write an editorial and you assume readers are going to see your coverage tied to that. My question is more about what has happened in terms of the diminishment of local news operations, where what has been the impact on credibility when you don't have a local newspaper anymore, and also when you don't have editorials in your newspapers. There's a big trend I know, and some of it I'm sure is financial, but there was a time when the editorial page was your shining star. It's your point of pride at the newspaper, and now you may have a couple of opinion columns. So what's going on in terms of the local journalism and what impact that has on credibility?
Walter, you're a keen observer of community news.
Yeah, but you're interested about a point about newspapers not having an editorial page. The New York Times doesn't publish their own editorial. Every now and then they'll publish an editorial. They used to have one every single day. Now they just put a column in there, typically. I mean, that just kind of shocked me when I saw that. I mean, because a lot of times people want to know, what does the newspaper believe? What do they stand for? What's their position? May not agree with you, but they want to know what your position is. But as far as, local news, so most of the surveys have been shown that the greatest credibility and trust is in local media. Local television's first, local newspapers second, local radio's third. Why is television higher than newspapers? That's the first question I asked. I thought, well, local TV stations usually don't have editorials. So that can't bleed over into people thinking, well, maybe they're, biased this way or the other. But the problem is, it's the national newspapers that have got the economic model to make money off of digital content, because they got all 50 states to draw subscribers from. A newspaper like ours in Little Rock, we've only got the state of Arkansas. We can't get enough subscribers in Arkansas to sustain us, So, at really low rates like $8 a month, $7 a month, et cetera. So, it's my concern is more and more local news organizations struggle and go out of business. That's going to just make the public have less trust in the overall media, because it shows the trust in the national newspapers is quite a bit less than the local newspapers.
Violet, I want to sneak one last question in here. when I was teaching, I learned that our students were consuming their news primarily from Twitter and other social media rather than mainstream media. Do you see that among your friends? And does that affect how they view objectivity and subjectivity?
I think first of all, yes, a lot of people do consume their news from social media that I know and just like from trends generally, whether it's on Twitter or you follow, say, the Washington Post on Instagram. But the thing about it is, all you see is that post. You see the headline and then maybe the caption. Not a lot of people are clicking the story and actually reading what was written behind the actual post. So I think that's one of the biggest issues with people getting their news from social media. And as it relates to objectivity, if they're not reading the actual story, I'm not sure that they're getting anything beyond just, the nut graph and the lead. You know what I mean? So I think people are forming their own opinions based off of limited facts, which is an issue. But yeah, I do wish more people would actually open the stories and read them.
Good, thank you. This has been a terrific discussion tonight, and I thank all of you panelists for providing your perspective. Join me in thanking the panel.